Welcome to Professionally Speaking TV. I am your guest host today, Michelle Naray, and today we are interviewing the interviewer. You're used to seeing Randall Craig asking the questions. Well, today he's going to be answering a few of my questions. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Randall, some things that you may not know. He's the president of Pine Tree Advisors. He's earned a CFA, MBA, CMC, and a black belt in karate. I know, I've sparred with him, not a man to mess with. He served the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers as the 2010 Toronto chapter president. He's written 6 books, including a bestseller, and he consults in the area of social media strategy across North America. In fact, he's been involved in internet strategy since 1993. I mean, think about it. Back then, Explorer didn't exist. Netscape was at 0.9. A long time. Randall Craig, welcome to Professionally Speaking TV.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Michelle.
So, Randall, you know, I just mentioned that you've been involved in internet strategy since 1993. Most people didn't even know what the internet was at the time. How did you get started? Where did you learn?
You know, I spent a lot of time as a management consultant at KPMG, and I had the fortune of being in the national marketing group, working on a number of technology projects, CRM, customer relationship management specifically. And when the internet came about, the World Wide Web, I instantly saw that there was a certain interesting possibility. It was right in the middle between technology on one side and marketing on the other. So I was the person who was the driver behind putting KPMG online. And I knew at that point that this was going to be very, very, very big. So between the marketing of services, marketing the things that weren't products, that really helped me understand really what the web possibility was, number one. And number two, working on a number of technology marketing projects helped me understand, well, the possibility. I'm not a technologist by training, but I know enough, even back then, to be dangerous.
You saw the clues that this was going to be big.
I saw the clues, and certainly, you know, the idea of using the web way back in '93 as a way to sell stuff, especially professional services. I was convinced that, first of all, it really wasn't possible to sell professional services using a website, but it was possible to help, well, a professional services firm demonstrate their expertise and improve the awareness. And certainly if you look at that relationship curve, the concept of moving people from awareness to preference to trial commitment, certainly the awareness and preference, if you had a website that said, gee, I'm great, people would say, yeah, right. But on the other hand, if you had a website that said, and demonstrated by example, here is our knowledge, please read it and make your own decisions as to whether you want to engage us, well, that would be something else. So that was my first foray into it, and from then it was history.
So you're talking about really engaging the customer at a deeper level than what, you know, typical classic sales brochure might be able to do. And that, you can see how that has morphed into social media today. So let's talk about social media. I mean, back then it was internet strategy. Now everywhere you turn.
Yeah? It was called social media. It wasn't called social media back then. But the challenges, certainly in the early 90s, about bulletin board systems and the idea of how do you get people to write on a bulletin board system and start that conversation and develop a community of interest. There's a whole hobbyist realm, if you will, that businesses were starting to look at and trying to figure out. And that was the challenge back then. How do you start that conversation? How do you get that community formed? And that was very, very, well, it certainly wasn't called social media, but it certainly was engagement.
Yeah, no.
And it wasn't web either, for that matter.
Well, I remember those BBMs, the bulletin board systems.
Yes.
Absolutely. So what are some of the challenges that clients face as they put together this? You're talking about creating community, building community, engaging customers and different stakeholders, and getting them involved in the conversation. What are some of the challenges that they have in doing that?
Well, probably the biggest challenge is to remember, certainly for an organization, that it's not about you. You know, you're a participant in the minds of the people who are actually engaging with you. So if you're trying to say, once again, oh, I'm so great, without adding value back, without asking the question, if you're always in broadcast mode, it's ironic. Here we are sitting on Professionally Speaking TV. We're broadcasting out to everybody else. Well, there isn't engagement. There's engagement between the two of us, but there isn't outside. And the challenge of most marketers is to say, well, how can we engage people where they are? How do we know where they are? How do we know what's important? The internet has allowed us to reach out not just into a particular geography, but also a certain psychographic and a certain demographic that need not all be in one place. And it's the intersection between reaching out to this natural market on one hand, and secondly, finding a way to bind that to the business strategy of the organization that's really the big challenge.
So when we're talking about engaging the customer, binding it to the business strategy, now that has not changed from the beginning. You're saying that's always been the challenge. Now we know that social media strategy, social media has changed dramatically. So tell me a little bit about those changes over the last, now 15 years.
Well, if I can bring us back to the olden times, which is 1994, I'd left KPMG at that point. I ended up working, starting my own firm, IMA, Internet Marketing Associates. It was the heyday of the internet and the dot-com. Well, it was actually perhaps a bit before then, actually. And we were engaged by Torstar to help them figure out what the business model of this internet thing should be. There were no newspapers online at that point. There were no publishing companies online at that point.
There wasn't no iPad.
There certainly was no iPad. There were no iPhones. There certainly wasn't a BlackBerry. But the challenge then was, okay, so we've got this internet thing. What are we going to do about it? And in that particular case, we came up with a process that said, okay, so let's get the information from the newsroom and post that online. But the real purpose of that wasn't just to post it online, but it was to say, this is another advertising venue, no different than the newspaper, no different than billboards, no different than a whole bunch of other advertising venues. And how can you find a way to grow the number of people that came back day after day to the Toronto Star online? On one hand. At the other hand, sell advertising so that there's an economic avenue. Nowadays, there's some big problems in the newspaper, publishing, broadcast world with respect to the internet because not everybody has been true to that core, which is selling advertising, selling sponsorship. There's a lot of movement to subscribers. There's a lot of movement to a bunch of other things as well. But right from the very, very beginning was a question of, okay, the business of the Toronto Star was selling advertising. Therefore, the business of the internet site called thestar.ca, thestar.com, should also be advertising. But we needed the information from the newsroom in order to be the vector on which to sell the ads.
So some things have stayed the same. Some of the challenges have stayed the same. Some of the way we solve those challenges have changed. What are some of the trends that you see? What are things that are in flux?
Well, there's a question about web and social media. Let me just move over to social media to answer that one first. If you take a look at all the social media stuff, 6-7 years ago there was no YouTube. This is unbelievable. Facebook was just an idea, effectively, and now these tools and some of the other ones, the Twitters, for example, the LinkedIns, these are very, very, very big. So there's been a lot of experimentation that a lot of organizations and individuals have actually done. But what I've been telling my clients now is that the age of experimentation is over. The age of experimentation is over. There are some best practices, and there are some things that you should perhaps stop doing. And maybe now is the time to look at things more strategically rather than just, well, because we've done this for the last couple of years on Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitter or whatever, we're going to keep on doing it. No. Now is the time to take a look at things more strategically.
So we're talking about best practices, and certainly now you've had a lot of experience. You've had enough experience to see what works and what doesn't. Hold that thought a second, because we're going to take a break. We're speaking to Randall Craig, the usual host of Professionally Speaking TV. And today he is on the other side of the table. He is answering my questions. When we come back from the break, we're going to find out what some of those best practices are. Thank you. Welcome back to Professionally Speaking TV. We are here speaking to social media strategy expert Randall Craig, and before the break he was just about to talk to us about best practices, things that he has learned over the years, and that's what I would like to come back to right now. I think that's what our viewers, our listeners want to hear. So you've been in this game a long time. You've worked with some of the biggest early adopters and some of the people who've come in since then. Talk to us about some of the experiences, who you've worked with, and what you've learned.
Well, you know, one of the things that we do with all of our clients is we say, you know, there's a number of models that you can use. I mentioned before the relationship curve, awareness, preference, trial, commitment. Nobody's going to actually purchase something, whether it be a product, a service, whatever, unless somebody's gone through those particular processes. If you think, for example, about the last time you bought a car. When you buy a car, you may see an ad and you say, oh, gee, I'm aware that such and such a car exists, and I'm aware that I need one. I'm driving a rust bucket. It's not very reliable. Gee, I know about Chevrolet. That's awareness. Preferences. Gee, I really prefer Chevrolet. That's what I prefer rather than, say, Ford. Trial is maybe going for a test drive. And that's what we typically do when we go to a dealership. We don't just say, here's my credit card, please, I want to drive out with a car. And then finally we commit, we actually sign on the dotted line. Now, the same thing really needs to happen in the social media world. So awareness, for example, of the problem and awareness of you as the service provider or the product provider. If you imagine underneath the word awareness, what are the marketing programs, what are the social media activities that might move people from awareness to preference? What are the social media activities that move people from preference to trial, from trial to commitment, and then close the sale commitment itself? So often it's just haphazard. We're going to do a Facebook page. Oh, we're going to be on LinkedIn. Or, oh, we're going to do YouTube or Twitter or whatever. But what's the goal of that particular activity? So probably the first best practice is to do a bit of an audit, do a bit of an inventory to say, okay, out of all the things that are doing right now, some of them might be very effective, but where do they fit in to that particular continuum? So doing a blog, for example, the fact that a blog exists might help with awareness. But you know what? When somebody reads the blog and says, gee, that person really understands what they're talking about, that's preference. But I'm not so sure it's exactly trial. And it's certainly not commitment. On the other hand, for example, if you do a social media program where you get, let people try out or see you in action, say through some YouTube videos, they could imagine themselves actually using the product by seeing what happens in the videos. That's a little bit more towards trial. It's a little bit. Or if you get people to film themselves using YouTube and then posting it up, well, that's evidence, in fact, of trial. So number one is to think in terms of this kind of model, the relationship curve, and say, okay, what is it that's currently happening? What oftentimes people do is they've got lots way on awareness. And they might have a lot, for example, at the very end, their commitment, the sales process, but they've got nothing in between. So what might actually be in between? Or they might have a lot for preference, but very little with awareness. The other thing that's pretty important, it's not a question of tack on. It's also a question of, well, where does social media end and traditional marketing begin? So what are you doing for PR, for example, or brochures, or trade shows, real life things? And oftentimes, and this is really the next best practice, it's the integration of all these marketing things together. And that's where you get 1 + 1 = 3. If you just do social media, if you just do traditional, you miss the boat a little bit.
So it sounds to me, because everything you're talking about is, I wouldn't say necessarily classic marketing, but they're all found, good, solid marketing principles. And what you're doing is you're saying, how does social media fit into this? Am I right?
Well, you're right, which means I'm right, but you're wrong. But,
so explain it.
Okay, so if people might remember the Marketing 101, this is the marketing that our grandfathers did. It was the 4 Ps. It was price, product, promo, place. Remember? And if you end up doing marketing, you make sure that you understand exactly what's the price, what kind of promotion, or advertising, whatever the promotion is, where are you going to sell it, place. So once you've got these 4 things, then you immediately understand exactly where you should be marketing. Today, we use terms like buzz marketing. We use terms like viral marketing. It's a very interesting thing that McDonald's and Burger King have got a fascinating way of looking at the market. McDonald's, at least a few years ago, I'm not so sure today, they would do tons and tons of analysis. They would take a look at the income in an area, the streets, the competitive. They do everything. They determine that right here is where we need to put one of our new restaurants. Burger King, on the other hand, looked around and said, well, McDonald's is here. We're going to go next door because they've done all the work. It's a similar kind of thing, McDonald's versus Burger King strategy with respect to marketing. If I know today that you are a buyer, then if I could look for people like you, or if I can empower you to share it with the like-minded people who are your friends, then it doesn't really matter price, product, place, or promo, because I know that you're the buyer. So the pendulum swung from the 4 Ps way over to viral marketing, and now it's moving a bit more to recognize that we need to understand the underlying attributes, on one hand, the 4 Ps. On the other hand, we need to really take a look at viral marketing, buzz marketing, and say, okay, where do these things intersect? So that way we're really using all of the tools today. We're not throwing the out with the with the bathwater. But what we are doing is we're saying some of these 4P things can be amplified if we use viral marketing techniques. And by the way, viral marketing techniques, she told 2 friends who told 2 friends who told friends who told 2 friends. This is something that is incredibly powerful, but it needs to be amplified based on the fundamentals.
So, best practices. We're back to best practices, and what you're talking about is all about best practices. And you mentioned that one of the key best practices that you've noticed is being consciously aware of that relationship curve and moving people through it. And I guess one of the mistakes, or would you say this, one of the mistakes that a lot of businesses make is maybe they just forget to do this. They forget to check what's working. You mentioned the audit.
Well, you know something, it's really... if we think about the Scouts and Rangers within a particular organization, these are those clever marketers and clever IT people who are got these antennas out as to what's new. And they may have started several years ago with this Facebook-y thing or this LinkedIn thing, YouTube, whatever it happened to be, and they sort of created a bit of a job for themselves. And they're foraging out in front of the organization, and they're saying, hey, here's something really neat that we can use, whether it's from technology, whether it's from marketing department. Scouts and Rangers are in both. And then these things take a little bit. And then all of a sudden, more and more time is being spent on these things that those people started. Now, these people are not usually hooked in to the strategy of the organization. They're just very clever, driven people who've got a sixth sense as to what might work. So what we need to do is we need to take a look and say, well, one sec, let's find out a way to harness this information, harness this energy, harness this organizational knowledge, but make sure that it's actually totally in line with the organization's marketing and technology strategy. And by the way, not just marketing and technology, but HR, recruiting, right? Operations, supply chain, financial, all the other areas that social media actually hits on, but too often, because it's driven from marketing or technology, it's forgotten.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing you say is that social media, great tools, people are using them, but are they using them strategically?
And that's the idea of connecting it into the strategy. Let me give you another idea of where organizations sometimes kind of forget about. Customer relationship management, CRM. This is the idea, for example, of somebody moving from a suspect to a prospect to a proposal outstanding to a client. Maybe after that they're a repeat client. Maybe after that they're no longer a client. But moving people through that process, there's a very, very tight connection between social media and CRM. We call it social CRM that too often organizations don't think about. As people move through that relationship curve, awareness, preference, trial, commitment, social media becomes a little less important. And CRM, the one-to-one relationship building between the organization and the prospective client or the existing client, becomes even more important. So how do you connect up a CRM system, which is usually very, very difficult,
Complex.
yeah, with social media?
So, good question. Thank you. How do you do that?
You spend more than 20 minutes in a TV show describing it. Part of it speaks to the issue of strategy, right? So if you, for example, have the awareness, preference, trial, commitment, you realize underneath each of them there may be a number of initiatives to move people from one to the other, from one to the other, one to the other. You realize that one of the important tools of actually moving people is CRM itself, right? So, for example, you could use CRM, communications, whether by email, whether by postal mail, whether by to-do list items or voicemail. All these things can be used to help, on one hand, drive engagement in the social media venues, but also move people towards transaction, right? Move people up to a more powerful one-to-one relationship between the organization and the individual, rather than just a community relationship, which is more important to say at awareness and preference, but less so on trial and commitment.
So, risks. Let's talk about risks, because earlier you just alluded to it, and I had a feeling that there's a lot more there that we need to be aware of in working with social media. What are some of the things that could go wrong if we try something? What are the things that maybe some businesses are ignoring?
You know, a lot of people in the social media space, 2 years ago they might have been selling PR or selling real estate or selling appliances, but they don't have the deeper experience, the number of bruises, if you will, to understand that. And there's this almost thought that if you sprinkle some social media juice on just about anything, you'll be successful, which is, of course, utter bunk. What the issue of risk? So a lot of our consulting isn't just social media strategy, but what are the policies and processes within an organization that need to be put in place to mitigate risk? I could talk about a couple of them right now. Probably the biggest one is identity theft. I could be you, or I could be actually any of our viewers in 10 minutes, 5 minutes on the internet. I could be you, Michelle, in 5 minutes. This is very, very big because most people who've got some degree of public persona, and most organizations who invest millions into their brands, don't do enough to actually mitigate the risks that somebody will take their brands, or somebody will do something that will tug their brand in the wrong direction. There's a number of sites that let me claim to be you. There's 5 of them out there. Number one, there's a number of sites, for example, just a very, very simple thing. Facebook.com/Randall Craig is owned, it's squatted on by me. So you cannot do that.
Yeah.
But is Facebook.com/Michelle Nere owned by you? Knowing you, probably yes. Yeah. Okay, but a lot of these organizations, Facebook.com/Coca-Cola,
right,
or /Coke, slash a whole bunch of other things.
This reminds me of going back 12 years ago when people actually nabbed domains of major companies and then sold them back to the company for sometimes huge amount of money.
And you know what? There's processes now that exist so that domain name squatting, which is what that was called, is a lot harder to do. There's a way that you can provide evidence that you're the trademark holder, for example, to the domain name authorities.
But you're saying those safeguards are not in place in the social media realm.
Well, something they are to a certain extent, but it is far, far, far more easy. It's far easier to preemptively address the risk rather than fight a rearguard action trying to
get it back.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So hold that thought, Randall, because when we come back from the break, I'm going to ask you about how we can mitigate those risks, what we can do to safeguard our names, our brands, our companies, our businesses. So what I'd like to do now is take a break. You're watching Professionally Speaking TV. I am speaking to social media strategy expert Randall Craig. And when we come back from the break, we're going to hear some of his suggestions on how we can protect our brands in social media. Welcome back to Professionally Speaking TV. We are here with Randall Craig, my guest today. He's an expert in social media strategy. And before the break, we were just talking about some of the risks that some of the companies face, or many companies face, especially in the area of identity theft. And we heard about domain squatting. That was 10 years ago. There are safeguards in place. Randall, you've been talking to us about how those safeguards are in place in domain squatting, but they're not quite in place, and so a lot of companies are exposed when in trying to protect their brands, their names, and in social media. So, talk to us.
You know, one of the things that most organizations can do. It's the simplest thing. There's a website, knowem.com, knowem.com, that if you go to, you could put in a username, Randall Craig, or do your own, obviously, your own brand, and it'll go out to all these different sites. There's over 500 of these social media sites out there, and it'll tell you whether indeed somebody has registered that name or not. And if you do actually go through and do it, you can then go take the next step and actually register your username, your account name at all these different sites. And that way, at least at the most basic level, somebody's actually, you've actually got those and not somebody else. That's the most basic thing that you can do. The other thing that you need to do is you need to remember that there's a lot of people, if you've done your marketing right, that are very excited about your brand, very excited about you if you're an individual, and they may have decided to create a fan page or a group, say on Facebook or on some other site.
On your behalf?
On your behalf. Well, on their behalf.
On their behalf.
On your behalf, on their behalf. And the challenge there is that you now have a decision. You could either shut them down and say, hey, that's us. We want 100% control. Or you can work with them and say, listen, why don't we give you some behind-the-scenes information, etc. And if they're the steward of your brand, if you trust them, that might be a way of going about it. Or maybe what you can do is you can say, well, we're going to compete with them, or we're going to ignore them. There's all these different alternatives. But when somebody else has got your brand, even if they're a benign dictator, that's not up to you. Yet, on the other hand, you don't want to stop these people who are passionate about your products, your services, because they're the ones at zero cost to you that can get your message out.
So, okay, you mentioned earlier that the age of experimentation is over, and I suppose if a company or business is continuing to try to do some social media strategy, throwing things on the wall, seeing what sticks, doing that kind of stuff, one of the risks might be having their brand co-opted or stolen or squatted on. What are some of the other risks?
You know, this is a simple thing. Mistaken identity is certainly one, certainly for individuals, also for organizations as well. Somebody does a Google search, there's a gazillion pages on Google. If they do a search, for example, for you, how do you know, and how do your customers know that the Randall Craig, for example, that they find is actually you?
So this is kind of like the flip side. In one case, it's identity theft. And now you're talking about mistaken identity.
Mistaken identity. And part of the challenge there is if there's, believe it or not, there's other Randall Craigs out there.
No.
There's a very well-known orchestral conductor. There's also probably the world's best-known Barbie clothes designer, doll clothes designer. Well, you know what? My particular challenge is how do I make sure that when people look for Randall Craig, they find the real one, me, as opposed to some of these other ones. Same with every other organization.
Have you ever gotten an inquiry that says, Randall, could you design a Barbie for me?
No, thankfully, because once again, there's some strategy behind it. The whole SEO world, search engine optimization, and the connection between your social media strategy and your search engine optimization and web strategy. This is really the intersection there. And so, if you do have a lot of these outposts, then you're more likely to go about being found, particularly if they're interlinked.
Now, you just threw a word out there. You called it an outpost. Now, is this a word that you've coined, you've created?
One of the strategies that we work with our clients on is creating what we call an outpost and anchor strategy. There's over 500 of these websites out there, social media sites out there, and no organization has got the bandwidth, and nor does it make sense to to cover all of them, yet clients may be at any of these particular ones. So the idea here is to say, maybe as an organization, you should focus on the anchors, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 at the absolute most, in terms of developing a community of interest. And all of these other obscure sites, social media sites as well as non-social media sites, those are outposts where you say, this is the business we're in. So there's some keywords there so people can search and find them. But we keep such and such site, our main site, or, for example, our social media sites, updated. Please interact with us there. So the outposts point to the anchors. The anchor points to your main site.
So that's interesting. This is a strategy, the anchor and outpost strategy that you've created, you've implemented for some clients?
You know something? It's not rocket science, but most of the organizations spend so much time trying to be everywhere that typically they're nowhere.
I guess this is a way to channel the resources more effectively, certainly more efficiently.
That's absolutely right. In fact, you can have your cake and eat it too with this particular strategy, because on one hand you're more efficient because you're only spending your time on the anchors. And the anchors for most large organizations are the big 4: LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, as well as your blog. But all these obscure outposts, you just have a very, very thin profile pointing back to your anchors and back to your main site.
So it's almost like spokes on a wheel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Let me talk about another risk that a lot of people don't think about, but perhaps they should, and that's what I call brand hijacking. And there's so much time spent developing your brand, but you know what? If it's only you, if it was 1950s and it's only you who has an impact on what that brand is, and one definition of brand is what people say behind your back. On social media, they're saying it right in front of you. So if you imagine, and most people have a Facebook profile, or at least know what it is, on their wall, you put something up there. I've just done such and such. Then somebody comments on that particular post. Well, if a third party reads your original post and then the comment on that post, your original post hopefully is making your brand stronger, because it's an in-brand comment. But how about when they read that comment, which is done by a third party? Well, if that comment is off target, if that comment is one that is, I'm going to say, negative, or it's obnoxiously positive, it's almost fake, that's going to tug your brand in the wrong direction. And most organizations, sadly, are gutless and spineless when it comes to, say, their Facebook profiles, because they say, brand hijacking, that's a real risk. We're going to completely turn off all of the comments, and all we're going to do is we're going to just broadcast out what we think, and that's it, which of course frustrates the people who actually have something to say, and by the way, makes it harder for marketers and others in the organization to learn what the market is saying. So gutless and spineless aside, you open up Facebook, you get those comments, and then you've got to deal with all these people whose comments are tugging it totally in the wrong direction.
And it happens.
It absolutely happens. You look at any major brand's page where they aren't gutless and spineless, and that's what we'll see.
So what do you do?
Well, there's a question about authenticity. And brands have to be authentic. If brands are fake, people can see it immediately. When I'm with a client, when I'm with my family, when I'm with my friends, if I'm up speaking in front of 1,000 people, I like to think that I'm still the same person. And if I'm a different person in each particular space, there's a bit of fakeness that tarnishes my brand, actually, and causes people to say, well, I'm not so sure if I can believe this particular person. And that's what's happening in the social media world. Brands have to be authentic. Yes, Coke is always refreshing. Yes, Apple is always innovative. But when it comes right down to it, things aren't perfect. And if the management teams and the marketers and the advertisers don't recognize that, sometimes mistakes happen. Sometimes things aren't perfect. Sometimes somebody who shouldn't be using the product is using the product. And by the way, not all the staff are perfect. They make mistakes too. You can earn an awful lot more respect and credibility if you're able to address the issues more specifically and more honestly. I don't know if you remember, several years ago, there's a fellow musician. He had a guitar, and the guitar was broken because of what the baggage handlers did on the tarmac. And he captured it all, and he tried to go to the United Airlines customer service, and he got stonewalled. They weren't interested in hearing anything. So he wrote a little song, and he put it on YouTube. Millions and millions of people listened to his terrible experiences with that airline. And all of a sudden, they're in crisis mode. Why? Because they didn't address things, firstly, through the channels they got set up, and secondly, they weren't aware of what was happening when that YouTube thing first came alive. If they had dealt with it preemptively or immediately after they realized there's an issue, we made a mistake. Here's what we did to make it better. And by the way, everybody else, if you've got this problem, it doesn't special case for him. This is how you go about resolving it. We're very, very sorry, and we know things like this happen. We're not perfect, but we try really, really hard, and we're going to make things right. This is a lot more open and honest, but it requires judgment. It requires monitoring. It requires, dare I say, strategy. And it requires some policies that are not from 20 years ago, but policies that are designed for today.
Well, it sounds to me like the policies and the strategies you're talking about acknowledge that we have an open relationship with individuals in a way that we never have before through social media. And mistakes happen, as you say, and we have to deal with those things honorably, ethically, in order to avoid the big catastrophes, and rather than brushing them under the rug.
So how much of an investment should an organization make in all this? Because if they spend all of their time,
Yeah, so how do you do this? How do you manage it?
You know what? What you can do is you can set up a cascading series of gates. So, for example, you can have somebody monitoring Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and some of the other anchor venues where you are. There's all kinds of software that will automate a lot of this. And so, you know, whenever there's comments of a certain type, you can pre-write some of those comments and give it to a first-line person with the authority to make changes to the general responses. So it doesn't seem like it's a canned response. You know, if something seems to be getting into the crisis zone, then it can be handled in a crisis mode. But the best way of dealing with it is to preemptively do it, right? If people are talking about you anyway, by allowing that conversation to take place under the auspices and under your ground rules, then you're more likely to guide the conversation to a proper resolution. And I don't mean by spinning things to be where they should be, but rather to be aware of what the market is saying, and to feed that back into product development, to feed that back into the communications, to feed it back into the senior executives, so that this is the greatest market research opportunity in the world ever. But if we set up the policies that prevent us from actually listening and reacting, then guess what? We've lost that opportunity.
So let's say I'm a client, you're working with me, and I've got a fan page, a business page, and I put something up, I put a comment up, and somebody posts something up that's not negative, but does pull me off track. So what would you recommend? What would you advise me to do?
Well, certainly for small businesses, you can get back and make a comment on the comment before it starts to develop momentum in an area that you don't want it to do. And you can essentially say, thanks for the comment, made some notes of it. By the way, here's some other ideas. Just a very simple way. If you want, you can post lots of other comments, frankly, to push that one down so it doesn't appear front and center for people come to your page. If it's something where somebody says your product or service is not good, then what you can do is you can go out to your crew, to your fans, if you will, and say, is this true? What do you think? Tell us what you think. We've got big ears for what you have to say. You know, there may be some people that say, yeah, the guy's exactly right, in which case it's better to find out. And there's going to be a lot of people that say, no, this person's way off base. And getting your fans to actually do this rather than you as an organization is really one of the great things once you've got that community of interest.
So talk to us a little bit more about some of the risks that companies face. So you've talked about identity theft, you've talked about, let me take a look at my notes. You've talked about mistaken identity, you've talked about brand hijacking. Seems to be if we don't manage this carefully, all kinds of terrible things could happen. What else?
Certainly there's some competitors that act a little bit unethically, and they go in to a social media site and write all kinds of terrible things. And in the restaurant world, we certainly see this. Terrible reviews, and you sort of find out who the reviewers are, and it seems that they seem to be very, very positive on one particular restaurant, and everybody who's a competitor to that restaurant has got terrible, terrible reviews. So, I mean, sometimes there's that kind of thing. There's denial of service attacks where people will keep on pinging or keep on doing stuff to prevent other people from having a say one way or the other. One of the biggest problem areas, one of the biggest risk areas is something that companies actually do themselves. And that's actually, or rather what they don't do themselves. Typically, social media policy, the internal policies, grow out of technology acceptable use policies. You shall not do this, you shall not do this. So for example, typically with these firewall technologies, many large organizations prevent their employees from actually going onto social media sites. Now, if there's CIOs and others listening to this, you're probably saying, damn right, productivity.
Yeah, productivity issues, people wasting their time and getting involved in personal conversations the whole day.
Well, you know something, we kind of had that with a telephone years and years and years ago.
True.
And
true.
It's not a question of using technology to block out. In the early days of the internet, the big concern was that people would bring in a modem and attach it to their PC and get access to this bulletin board system or whatever it is outside, and that'd be a huge security threat. Nowadays, it's we don't have the issue of modems, thankfully, but we do have the issue of people coming in with their iPhones and iPads and other smartphones and frankly wasting their time on Facebook and on YouTube and on Twitter and LinkedIn, all those things using their own devices. In fact, today, people bring more firepower into the organization than often there is within the organization itself. Firepower, processing power, technology. So the issue is not how do we firewall and prevent people from actually using these social media tools. The issue is one of plain old management. If you're a manager and you're managing a team, you should be managing them to task. If you're managing by saying you can't do Facebook, you can't do YouTube, you can't talk to your significant other on the telephone, that's bad productivity, then you'll always be fighting a rearguard action against these so-called distractions.
So is there a way to harness the horsepower, the technology that people are bringing in and actually use it for the good of the business?
Well, you know, I don't even think it's a question of harnessing that technology. It's really even more basic. It goes back to management. And making sure that managers actually manage to task, manage the people, motivate, the whole bit thing, number one. Number two, why in the world would you shut off a communications tool where all of your clients and all of your prospective clients and all your prospective recruits are actually on there? Why would you, we say listen to the customer, but by the way, we can't listen using this channel or that channel or the other. There's over 500,000 people on Facebook. There's approaching 100 million people on LinkedIn. More videos are uploaded to YouTube in a minute than there are in hours of the day. So there's all this conversation happening, and we as corporate America say, well, we can't have people listening or being aware of those things because it might affect their productivity. Nuh-uh. If you're managing properly to task and everything, if your staff says, all of our clients are out there, or in HR, all of our prospective candidates there. Why wouldn't we be part of that and positioning ourselves? It doesn't mean that the day job goes away. It may mean that certain parts of your day job you do less of, and other parts you might do more of. But why would we shut that down? So the big challenge here is the internal policies that existed for 5 years ago and 10 years ago, way back in ancient times, are suddenly not as applicable when we actually want to interact. It's a multi to multi, not a one to many.
Randall, just hold that thought for a minute. When we come back from the break, I'm going to be asking Randall about him personally, his own personal social media habits, what he does on the internet and in social media. You are watching Professionally Speaking TV. We are talking to Randall Craig, social media expert. And when we come back from the break, we're going to learn more about Randall the person. Stay with us. Welcome back to Professionally Speaking TV. We are here with Randall Craig, social media strategy expert. And before the break, we were talking about some of the risks that companies face and some of the things that they're doing or not doing that might put them at risk. And Randall just started hinting at some of the things that are in store for the future. So that's where I'd like to take it now. Randall, you've been in social media, you've been in the internet, involved in internet strategy since 1993, long time. You've seen the changes. You've talked about how the era of experimentation is over. Things are set now, or not completely set. You've seen best practices. You also, I bet, have a hint of where things are going. So let's talk about that. What are some of the things that we're going to be seeing in the realm of social media?
Probably one of the most exciting things, and this is going to change the face of commerce, is what Facebook is doing, believe it or not. Facebook has got something called Facebook credits. Facebook credits, you play a game, you earn credits. You can buy these credits in the United States in certain retail stores.
For real money.
For real money. And then you can spend those credits in Facebook actually buying greater levels, greater capabilities in games, whatever it happens to be. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that at some point Facebook is going to take these credits and they're going to go to other retailers, online retailers, they're going to say, hey, instead of just taking cash or rather credit cards, what about paying for things in credits?
Facebook credits.
Go to Amazon.com. I don't know if Amazon will do this or not, but pay for things in credits. And by the way, the reason why a retailer might be interested in doing this is that the discount rate, the percentage charge for that kind of thing might actually be less than if they used a traditional credit card. And by the way, they may even get a discount on Facebook advertising. It doesn't take much to say, okay, from there, where might this go? You might be able to have your Facebook card and go to a real-life retailer and pay for it with this virtual currency as well. Can you imagine Facebook taking a percentage of every transaction, whether it's on the web or in real life? This is a huge change, and they've got the size to make this possible. So watch out for Facebook credits, an interesting thing.
As you're talking about this, my mind is racing because it sounds to me like the possibilities, especially with Facebook, is global reach. Could it be possible that Facebook credits will end up being a global currency, something that we've been talking about for a long time?
I don't know. I don't know. The issues of sovereignty aside, but it really is. Another trend is the issue of privacy. And what I say is free always free, because what we're doing effectively is we're paying for all this functionality of all these social media sites. And yes, you can pay to be a premium LinkedIn subscriber. Yes, you can pay to get a little bit of extra functionality, but we're paying for all the base functionality with our privacy. We're the ones
selling our own data.
Effectively, we go into Facebook. Their business model, for example, is advertising. Same thing with Google. Same thing with pretty much everybody out there. So we're very keen to say what our mother's maiden name is. We're very keen to give all kinds of demographics. And these organizations have got a great desire, and their business model requires them to actually open up the privacy, your information, to advertisers. And we willingly do this. On the other hand, there's a lot of legislation that says, well, one sec, your information is private. But we sign that away oftentimes. And I see there's going to be a little bit of a tussle coming up because everybody likes free, but not everybody is really understanding of what the cost is in terms of privacy until it's too late. That's another thing. Probably another one, if I could point out, is what's happening in the cloud. The internet functionality that's out there. It's pretty amazing. In the olden days, it was Microsoft with their Office suite and Windows and client server, and before that it was mainframes and everything. But now everything's up there. Google Docs, you can have free word processing and spreadsheets, Everything is up there. So the question is, what do you need? What do you need Microsoft for, or any of these other PC-based systems, if everything is up on the cloud?
Traditional purchasing of software. You're seeing that decline in...
Well, you know something, HP spent billions on buying the old Palm, specifically for their cloud-based operating system. The iPad, wonderful device. It doesn't run Windows, does it? Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's a device designed only to allow consumption of cloud-based resources. So we're seeing all of these things start to be not client-server technology focused, but instead cloud focused. And that means that there's a fundamental change happening for those who've laden down with Microsoft and with some of the traditional PC and server-centric companies.
So, Randall, in the few minutes that we have left, you've talked about where you've come and the history of social media and where it's gone, where it might be going, how we might be able to take advantage of some of these trends and opportunities. You personally do a lot of things. You consult on these issues. You speak on these issues. You're an author. You've written a book on these issues. A whole bunch of other things. Let's talk about Randall, the person here. What do you like to do?
You know something, it all sort of fits together. You know, you do consulting, you do some things that nobody else could have done, and that gives you some experience. I could generalize that experience and put it into my books. I got a half a dozen of them. Those books help credentialize me to speak. And when I speak, that helps expose me and my firm, Pine Tree Advisors, to prospective new clients. So that's a very, very interesting closed loop. But you know, for me, it's a question of how do you make a difference in society using these things? You know, how can you simplify stuff that seems to be ridiculously complex, so that organizations as well as individuals can make a difference? One of the terms that I use is, how do you land the strategy airplane? How do you take it from 30,000 feet down to 500 and then land it properly? That's what gives me a lot of personal satisfaction, and in everything that I do, that's really where my focus is.
Now, you also lecture at Schulich School of Business.
You know, working with younger people who've got these great ideas. Schulich is an amazing organization. It also has really opened my eyes to the issue of diversity and the importance, frankly, of looking at things from completely different perspectives. That's a very, very international business school. So typically, most people in the audience, most of the class are from all over the world, and that makes it incredibly valuable. Certainly for me, but hopefully that I'm able to help them too. And you interact with them using social media? You engage them? You bring them as part of your community? Without a question.
Yeah.
Without a question. People find me. It's pretty simple.
So where can they find you?
Go to randallcraig.com, RANDALLCRAIG.com. I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles, all at no cost. I've got a bunch of my books that are up there. I've got a bunch of white papers if people are interested. And just start the conversation. Start reading some of my stuff and give me a call.
If somebody comes in using one of these social media sites, are you on? How can they find you there?
I'm on them all.
Facebook, you're there?
Facebook, YouTube,
LinkedIn,
Twitter.
How do they follow you on Twitter?
Yes. Randall Craig, RANDALLCRAIG. And all kinds of stuff. I don't believe in putting stuff out there that's very low value. Everything that I put out there is really helping people figure out how to change that knowledge into action. And so whether it's my tweets, whether it be this show, for example, whether it be my blog postings or my newsletter or any of the other stuff, it's all about how to translate that knowledge to action, how to land that strategy airplane. Or your live presentations? Or my live presentation. So what was one of your favorite, your most memorable live presentation you've ever done? You know what? My most memorable one was, you know, for anybody who speaks in front of groups, it's always when the light bulbs go on. It's always that. But my most memorable one was one where that something happened just before I went on. And the CEO of this particular organization, the theme of the conference was passing the ball or something like that. And we're in this big conference room. And he decided that he was going to say a couple opening remarks from the doorway of this huge conference room. He had this Nerf football, or it wasn't Nerf, it was a plastic one. And he says the most important thing is to pass the ball. and he threw the ball. And most of these conference rooms have got these chandeliers with lots of little pieces of crystal or whatever, and went right through the chandelier. And where I was standing just off the side of the stage, it rained all over me and all over the stage and all over my equipment, everything. And on one hand, it was just absolutely hilarious. On the other hand, it was just mortifying for the
Murphy's
CEO.
Law at work, yeah.
But the conference went very, very well. A little bit of humor and everything, but it was memorable because it just, stay on points. You're there to do a particular job. You're there to make people laugh a little bit, but you're there to impart knowledge so that they can land their strategy airplane. So I ended up doing that at the very end, but it was very funny at the beginning.
I wish I had been there. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to Professionally Speaking TV. We have been talking to your usual host, Randall Craig, social media strategy expert. My name is Michelle Nere. I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to encourage you to check out our upcoming schedule and other great interviews at www.professionallyspeakingtv.com. Until next time, if you want to make an impact, say it professionally. Thank you very much.